Across the scarred face of Europe, the Third Reich was collapsing under its own ambition. On the frozen Eastern Front, men froze upright in their foxholes, eyes glassed over in death before morning came. Hunger had hollowed out entire regiments. Lice moved from corpse to living flesh as if the two were the same. A single crust of bread was a prize. Gunfire had become background noise. What truly killed was the cold. It was the kind of winter that stripped men of everything except the instinct to survive, even if that meant surrender. And for thousands of German soldiers, surrender would come not to the Soviets, but to the Americans. The journey westward began in fear. Those who had seen the Soviets' vengeance whispered of camps where no one came back. Rumors spread of columns of prisoners dying in the snow, of guards who shot for amusement. Better the Americans, some muttered. But none knew what that really meant. When they finally laid down their rifles in the crumbling cities of North Africa or among the olive groves of Italy, the war ended not with fanfare, but with the hollow click of safety catches and the smell of dust and diesel. They were herded onto trucks, then ships, packed so tightly that even the sea breeze smelled of men and despair. Days at sea blurred into a dull rhythm of metal clanging and waves slapping against steel hulls. Guards stood silent, rifles slung but rarely raised. One prisoner, once a mechanic from Bremen, said later that the sound of the engines was the first lullaby he'd heard since 1939. They crossed the Atlantic under the watch of the U.S. Navy, the same Navy they had once been taught to destroy. When the coastline finally appeared, a thin blue line beneath a copper sky, many of them wept, though none could explain why. Perhaps it was the sight of land not reduced to ash. After weeks on the rails through Texas and New Mexico, the train stopped in the desert near Phoenix, Arizona. It was December, but the air was warm and smelled faintly of orange blossoms. Sand shimmered like gold dust beneath a sky so bright it made the men squint. "America," someone whispered, as if naming a planet. Guards motioned them out, no shouting, no bayonets prodding ribs. Instead, they were handed tin cups of water, so cold it stung the throat. The prisoners drank greedily, water spilling down their bearded faces, their bodies trembling from exhaustion and disbelief. Before them stood Camp Papago Park. It was vast, neat rows of low wooden barracks, whitewashed fences, even a small chapel and baseball field beyond the wire. Palm trees swayed where watchtowers should have cast shadows. The desert air was still, the silence broken only by the chirr of crickets and the clatter of distant typewriters. "This cannot be a prison," one soldier murmured. "It looks like a holiday camp." For men who had marched through Stalingrad's ruins, the sight was otherworldly. Inside, each barrack had bunks with mattresses, sheets, even electric lights. There was a mess hall where cooks in white aprons served stew thick with meat. Some prisoners ate slowly, suspicious of the flavor, expecting a trick. One officer, pale and trembling, crossed himself before swallowing his first bite. "It's real," another said softly. "They are feeding us." The guards, mostly young American servicemen, seemed almost casual, some laughing, others leaning against fence posts with coffee mugs in hand. They spoke in slow English, sometimes broken German, asking names and offering cigarettes. The prisoners didn't know how to react. They had been taught Americans were monsters, a nation of crude brutes and cowards. Yet here they were, treated not as beasts but as men. It was disorienting, even humiliating. At night, the desert cooled sharply. The prisoners lay awake under wool blankets, listening to the hum of electric bulbs and the distant whine of a radio from the guardhouse. For the first time in years, no artillery echoed, no screams cut the dark. A strange calm filled the air. Some men cried quietly, others stared at the ceiling as if waiting for the illusion to end. A sergeant from Hamburg whispered, "If my wife could see me now, warm, fed, alive, she would think I had gone to heaven." The next morning, they were given soap, razors, and fresh uniforms marked PW. The showers ran with hot water, steam curling through the wooden stalls. The sound of laughter, real laughter, spread for the first time since captivity began. One man held his hand beneath the running water and muttered, "Not even at home did we have this." The American philosophy was simple. Treat them well, show them democracy, win hearts without firing a shot. It was strategy wrapped in kindness. Still, discipline remained. Roll call at dawn, lights out by 9, no one beyond the fence line. But within those boundaries, life was unexpectedly full. Some played chess or soccer. Others built model ships from scrap wood. A few, former engineers, designed small windmills to catch the desert breeze. And in the evenings, they stood by the wire, watching the sky turn crimson over the Arizona hills. "It's too beautiful," one muttered. "It feels wrong to be happy here." Letters from home began arriving through the Red Cross. Some carried news of families alive, others confirmed losses. Those who had served on the Eastern Front spoke the least. They had seen things that made beauty painful. A thin man named Keller, who had lost 3 fingers to frostbite near Kursk, spent hours sketching the camp, palms, barracks, the smiling guards. "For proof," he said. "No one in Germany will believe this." One afternoon, an American captain gathered a few of the men near the fence and pointed toward the distant city skyline. "That's Phoenix," he said. "You can see it if you climb the tower." He laughed softly. "Don't get any ideas." But of course, ideas had already begun to form. For all its peace, Papago Park was still a prison. Freedom shimmered just beyond the wire, as golden and unreachable as the horizon itself. That night, under the desert moon, a group of naval officers sat in their barack whispering in low voices. They had been U-boat men once, proud of their discipline, their cunning. One of them traced a line in the sand with a stick, marking the perimeter, then another line curving beneath it. "It can be done," he said. "If we dig here." The others looked around the dimly lit room, the bunk beds, the electric lamp, the soft hum of a radio playing American swing music. Outside, the guards were laughing about baseball scores. The air smelled of soap and warm bread from the kitchen. It was, by all appearances, a paradise. But in the eyes of those men, paradise had become a challenge. As the lights dimmed, Keller looked out through the barred window at the endless desert and whispered to himself, "Heaven, yes, but even angels might want to fly." The desert had its own rhythm, one that even prisoners could learn. By early 1945, the men of Camp Papago had settled into a life that felt, by every measure, unreal. Morning bugle, roll call, breakfast of oatmeal and coffee, then work details under a sun that turned the sand to white fire. At noon, the heat shimmered so thick that even the watchtowers seemed to waver like mirages. The men learned to move slowly, conserving sweat like gold. "We are in captivity," one joked, "but at least the guards are polite." It was a strange captivity, without brutality, without hunger, almost without hatred. The Americans ran the camp with quiet efficiency. There were rules, yes. No escape, no violence, no political talk, but they were enforced with patience more than punishment. When a man was caught hoarding bread, the guard didn't strike him. Instead, he said gently, "You don't have to do that here, pal. There'll be more tomorrow." The German froze, unsure whether to feel insulted or grateful. It was the kind of mercy that confused more than comforted. Each prisoner was assigned small tasks: kitchen duty, latrine cleaning, grounds maintenance. The officers were exempt, of course. Old habits of rank carried on even behind wire. A few men, including Keller the sketch artist, volunteered for outside work crews, picking cotton and repairing irrigation ditches under the Arizona sun. They were paid in canteen tokens, thin discs of metal that could buy chocolate, cigarettes, or Coca-Cola. When Keller tasted the dark, fizzy sweetness for the first time, he coughed and laughed at once. "It tastes like liberty," he said. The Americans encouraged recreation. Soccer matches turned the parade ground into a swirl of dust and laughter. There were painting lessons, lectures on English, even Sunday concerts by a camp orchestra made from scavenged instruments. Some of the guards joined in. One corporal named Jim taught them the rules of baseball, shouting from the sidelines as the Germans swung clumsily at the ball, boots slipping in the sand. "Strike two," he'd yell, grinning. "You swing like a politician." Even the officers laugh. For a moment, rank dissolved, replaced by something simpler, exhaustion and amusement under a forgiving sky. But not everyone could adjust. Captain Wattenberg, the former U-boat commander, carried himself with the stiff pride of a man still at war. He kept his uniform immaculate, his posture rigid, his contempt quiet but sharp. "This is no paradise," he told those who grew too comfortable. "It's a cage lined with velvet. Don't forget what you are, soldiers of the Reich." His words landed heavily on younger men who wanted to forget. Yet his authority remained, carved from discipline and memory. In the evenings, when the floodlights flickered on and the desert cooled, the prisoners gathered in small groups outside their barrack. Some sang old songs, their voices echoing softly across the sand. Others smoked in silence, eyes fixed on the mountains. The stars were impossibly bright, the kind of stars no one saw in Europe anymore. Under that endless sky, the men felt both tiny and safe. The war was far away. Radio reports spoke of bombed cities, of defeat, of surrender, but here time stood still. It was a peace that tasted faintly of guilt. Letters from home brought the war back in ink. "Berlin burns," one man read aloud in disbelief. Another, trembling, learned that his wife had remarried. Some letters came from mothers who still believed their sons were fighting bravely for the fatherland. They signed them with phrases like "Für den Sieg," for victory. The men folded these carefully and hid them beneath their pillows, unwilling to admit that victory was now an American dinner menu with meat twice a week. The guards seemed to understand the strange pride of their prisoners. They rarely mocked, never preached. Instead, they let the contrast speak for itself. The POWs were shown films in the rec hall, Frank Capra comedies, musical reels, even It's a Wonderful Life. For many Germans, it was their first glimpse of American cities alive and unscarred, of people laughing freely in theaters. After one screening, Keller whispered, "Their buildings stand. Ours are dust." No one replied. One afternoon, the prisoners were allowed to swim in the canal that bordered the camp. The water was shockingly cold, glittering beneath the sun. They dove, splashed, shouted, forgetting the wire for a brief hour. An American sergeant leaned against the fence, watching. "You fellas look like kids," he said with a smile. "Don't drown, I got paperwork if you do." When the whistle blew to return, some hesitated. The desert wind rustled through the palms as if whispering, "Freedom is only a few steps further." That evening, Wattenberg gathered his most trusted men, naval officers, disciplined and loyal. They met quietly in the barracks corner, pretending to play cards. "We cannot rot here while the fatherland bleeds," he said. "We will remind them that German will remains unbroken." He spoke of a plan, one that had been taking shape since the first night, an escape through a tunnel carved beneath the desert. His tone was calm, almost reverent, as if describing a religious act. "The Americans think kindness tames us," he said. "They forget who we are." Keller, overhearing, felt a strange conflict stir within him. He admired the captain's conviction, but part of him wondered what loyalty meant when the war was already lost. The camp had given him peace, food, the ability to draw again. Yet the idea of freedom, it burned in every man like an ember. Could he live with comfort while his conscience whispered traitor? Days slipped by. The rhythm of paradise continued, chores, laughter, letters, games, but beneath it all the soil shifted. Men whispered of measurements, of secret wood beams, of maps drawn in soap. Even the most content among them felt the tension rise like static in the air. One evening, a guard passed by, humming a tune, and Keller flinched, thinking of the tunnel he now helped to conceal. Guilt had replaced hunger as the camp's new torment. By spring, the men moved like actors on a stage, smiling, playing, pretending to forget. But at night, when the wind carried the scent of rain and sand, Keller would glance toward the compound's far corner, where the ground looked no different from anywhere else. Yet beneath it, men worked in silence, scraping away at their gilded prison. Life in Camp Papago had taught them strange lessons, that mercy could feel like mockery, that peace could sting worse than pain. Each sunrise over the Arizona desert brought comfort and unease in equal measure. And as the days grew longer, Keller began to sense that the real battle no longer lay in Europe, but here, inside the quiet war between gratitude and pride. One night, when the guards extinguished the floodlights early, the camp fell into unusual darkness. Keller looked up at the black sky and felt something tighten in his chest. The stars had never seemed closer. Somewhere beneath his feet, Wattenberg's men were digging toward them. He whispered the word that had haunted him since his first day in America, Freiheit. And for the first time, he wasn't sure whether it meant salvation or the beginning of their downfall. The winter of 1944 came softly to Arizona. The desert, usually a furnace, turned cold and sharp under a silver sky. Frost crusted the camp fences at dawn, and the wind carried the scent of distant rain. Beneath that quiet, beneath the sand itself, another kind of weather was forming, one of calculation, secrecy, and stubborn pride. The tunnel had begun. It started as an idea whispered by Captain Wattenberg, whose voice carried the authority of a man who refused to surrender even after the war had turned against him. The Reich may fall, he told his men in the dim light of the barack, but a soldier does not. His words drew a small circle of believers, naval officers, engineers, and a few restless souls who could no longer bear the stillness of captivity. Among them was Keller, the quiet artist who had once thought paradise could heal a broken man. Now, every kindness from his captors felt like a test he was failing. The digging began one moonless night in November. Beneath the barack's sink, a loose board concealed the opening. They took turns working in pairs, one shoveling, one filling sacks with sand. The tunnel was narrow, barely wide enough to crawl through. The air was stifling, smelling of sweat, earth, and the faint sweetness of pine boards stolen from bunks. They used mess tins as shovels, soup cans as lanterns, and string lines to mark their direction. Every sound mattered, the scrape of metal, the groan of shifting soil. Above them, guards' boots echoed faintly, each step a drumbeat of risk. The dirt was smuggled out in ingenious ways. They carried it in pockets, dumped it into garden beds, or scattered it in the camp's baseball field. Some men hid sand in their trousers, shaking it loose while walking, like ants in uniform. Keller drew sketches to mark progress, precise lines and angles that looked innocent to the untrained eye. At night, he stared at his drawings, realizing he had become an architect of defiance. For weeks, no one outside their circle suspected a thing. The Americans had grown comfortable too, lulled by the camp's calm. Guards smoked lazily in their towers, laughing at jokes carried by the wind. Some even left their posts for coffee. It was, as one prisoner said, the perfect place to be imperfect. But perfection made people careless. The tunnel stretched farther each day, 60 feet, then 90, then 100. The men reinforced its walls with stolen bed slats, wrapping the joints in rags soaked with oil to keep them from creaking. It became a living thing, pulsing with the breath of those inside it. "We dig toward freedom," one whispered, "but it feels like digging into the heart of the earth." Keller struggled with his conscience. Each night he watched the guards playing cards through the fence, heard the easy laughter of men who had stopped seeing them as enemies. He remembered the hot showers, the kindness, the day they were given turkey on Thanksgiving. The thought of betraying that generosity gnawed at him. But then he would see Wattenberg's face, stern, proud, unyielding, and the doubt melted into obedience. He was, after all, still a soldier. By mid-December, the tunnel reached its full length, 178 feet, ending beyond the fence line near a dry creek bed. The exit was disguised beneath a patch of tumbleweed and a few loose stones. When Wattenberg tested it himself, crawling through the darkness with a lantern, the air nearly suffocated him. But when he emerged into the cool desert night, he laughed, a low, hoarse laugh that sounded like victory. "We are free men again," he said, brushing sand from his uniform. They chose Christmas Eve for the escape. It was the one night they knew the guards would be distracted, half drunk on coffee and sentiment. In the mess hall, a Christmas tree stood glittering with paper ornaments cut from ration boxes. The Americans had even delivered small gifts: soap, candy, a few cigars. "Merry Christmas, boys," one guard said, grinning through the fence. The irony was not lost on anyone. That night, while the rest of the camp slept beneath the soft hum of the desert wind, 25 men gathered in silence inside Barrack A. Each carried a small pack, water, crackers, a compass, and a scrap of hope. Keller's hands trembled as he tied his boots. The barrack clock struck 11. Wattenberg gave a short nod, and one by one, they crawled beneath the sink and disappeared into the earth. The tunnel was colder than expected, the air stale and damp. Each man carried a candle stub, the flame flickering in the narrow dark. Their breaths echoed like whispers of ghosts. When the first man reached the end, he pushed aside the stones and tumbled out into open night. The sky was vast and starlit, the moon hung low over the desert. For a moment, no one moved, they simply stared at the freedom that lay before them. Then Wattenberg whispered, "Los." They scattered into the desert in pairs, heading south toward Mexico. The sand crunched under their boots, and the air smelled of sagebrush and cold wind. They walked quickly, silently, hearts pounding with exhilaration and fear. Behind them, Papago Park slept peacefully, unaware that its prisoners had vanished beneath its feet. But freedom, they soon learned, was more merciless than captivity. The desert was endless, featureless, and dry. Water ran out by morning. The sun rose like a furnace, erasing their footprints but burning their skin raw. Keller's group found an abandoned farmhouse by the second night and took shelter, only to discover the well was empty. He drank from a rusty tin and tasted sand. "We traded heaven for hell," one man muttered. By the third day, exhaustion set in. Some gave up, waving down passing farmers. Others tried to follow the canals, believing they led to the Mexican border. One man was caught stealing bread from a chicken coop and asked his captors for coffee before surrendering. The Americans, bewildered, offered him pancakes too. Wattenberg's group lasted longest, hiding by day and walking by night. He carried himself like a ghost of his former command, guiding them through cacti and dry ravines. But on the 8th day, even he could no longer deny defeat. When they stumbled upon a ranch house, its porch glowing with lamplight, he turned to Keller and said quietly, "We are soldiers. But even soldiers need mercy." They walked to the door and knocked. The farmer who opened it didn't reach for a weapon. He simply looked at their worn faces, sighed, and said, "You boys from Papago? Dinner's on the stove." That night, when the guards drove them back to the camp, the Americans were laughing softly, shaking their heads. "You nearly made it," one said. Wattenberg sat in the truck bed, staring at the desert sliding past, the same desert he had tunneled beneath, now radiant beneath a full moon. Back inside the wire, Keller stood near the tunnel's sealed entrance and felt both relief and shame. Freedom had been a mirage, and paradise, it seemed, had never truly been lost. Still, as the lights of the camp flickered back on, one thought refused to leave him. If mercy could not break the will of a soldier, perhaps it could change the heart of one. Spring arrived quietly in the Arizona desert. The night softened and the wind lost its edge. Cacti bloomed in small bursts of pink and gold beyond the wire fences, and the prisoners of Camp Papago returned to their routines as though the great escape had been a dream swallowed by sand. The Americans patched the ground where the tunnel had once opened and built a vegetable garden over it. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Freedom buried beneath a row of carrots and beans. There was no punishment, not really. The guards laughed about it now, calling it the most polite jailbreak in history. The escaped men were returned, tired but unharmed, and after a few stern lectures, they were allowed back to their barracks. When an American officer asked Captain Wattenberg why he did it, he simply replied, "Because I am a German officer." The captain's calm defiance seemed to amuse his captors more than anger them. One guard told him, "Next time, tell us first, we'll pack you a lunch." Wattenberg didn't smile, but Keller did, quietly, from behind him. Something had changed in the camp after that. The men's pride was still intact, but their certainty was gone. They began to look at the guards differently, not as enemies, but as human beings wearing different colors. The Americans, too, seemed to soften. Rules were still rules, but now there was understanding behind them. When the prisoners worked in the fields or cleaned the barracks, they were offered cold lemonade instead of orders barked through a megaphone. Even the fences felt less like cages and more like reminders that war, in all its madness, had boundaries. The desert became their classroom. Keller often walked along the inner fence at sunset, sketchbook in hand, drawing the watchtowers, the palms, the faces of men who had once believed the world ended at the Rhine. He began to draw the Americans, too, one in particular, a guard named Jim who always whistled when he walked. Jim once caught him sketching and asked, "You making me look handsome?" Keller answered, "No. Human." Jim laughed and offered him a cigarette. It became their ritual. One would draw, the other would hum a tune neither fully knew. By April 1945, news drifted into the camp like wind through the fence. Berlin surrounded. Hitler silent. The Reich dissolving into dust. The men listened around the radio in stunned quiet, eyes fixed on the ground. For years they had been told Germany was invincible, eternal. Now it sounded like a story told by tired men to themselves. Some cheered quietly at the mention of surrender, others turned away in shame. Wattenberg stood in the doorway of his barrack, shoulders heavy, the desert sun bleaching his once proud uniform to a dull brown. "It's over," he murmured. "And I don't know what that means." That night, the Americans lit lanterns around the camp and invited the prisoners to a small gathering. It wasn't a celebration of victory, more like a gesture of peace. A few guards brought guitars. Someone brewed coffee strong enough to sting the eyes. Keller sat beside Jim, who poured him a cup and said, "You'll be going home soon, friend." Keller looked into the dark liquid, thinking of what home meant now, a land he no longer recognized, cities turned to ash, a family that might be gone. "Do you think they'll believe us?" he asked. Jim frowned. "About what?" "About how kind you were." The next morning, the camp's flagpole stood bare. The German prisoners, unprompted, raised a white bedsheet at half-mast. No one said the word surrender, but they didn't need to. It hung in the air, tender and heavy. The Americans saluted it in silence. In that moment, the war ended. Not in a treaty, not in Berlin, but here, in a quiet desert where enemies had shared cigarettes and songs. Weeks passed. Trucks began arriving to take men away, north, east, back to ports where ships waited. Keller watched as one group after another left, waving through the wire until the dust swallowed them. When his turn came, he packed his few belongings. The sketchbook, a small harmonica, and a letter from Jim that read simply, "You were a good prisoner and a better man." He folded it carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket. As the convoy rolled out of Camp Papago, the landscape stretched endlessly, flat plains shimmering with heat, dotted with the same cactus and sand that had once felt like punishment. Keller stared out the window and thought about the tunnel, about Wattenberg's unbroken pride, about the farmers who gave them food instead of bullets. He realized then that freedom had many faces, one made of wire, another of mercy. Both could shape a man forever. The ship home crossed a calmer ocean than the one that had carried them here. The prisoners slept under American blankets, ate American food, and watched the horizon grow brighter each morning. When they docked in Europe, what awaited them was not homecoming but silence. Germany was in ruins, its cities hollow, its people gaunt. Some civilians spat at returning POWs, calling them cowards who had lived while others died. Keller walked through the rubble of Bremen and found the street where his mother's house had once stood. There was nothing left but bricks and memory. He opened his sketchbook there, among the ruins, and drew the desert, the palms, the guard towers. A man named Jim, smiling with a cigarette. Beneath it, he wrote in small letters, Papago, heaven compared to the East. It wasn't mockery. It was gratitude. He understood now that survival itself had been an act of grace, and that mercy could be as revolutionary as any army. Years later, when peace had long since settled over the world, Keller would tell his grandson about that strange camp in Arizona. He never spoke of ideology or defeat, only of the day he learned that compassion was not weakness, that dignity could outlast empire. He would say, "They gave us meat on Sundays, warm water, music. They gave us the chance to feel human again." That was their victory. Back in Arizona, the desert reclaimed what man had built. The camp was dismantled, the wood repurposed for homes, the fences melted down for tools. Only the foundation of the mess hall remained, half buried in sand. Sometimes, hikers passing through Papago Park stumbled upon it and wondered what stories had unfolded there, how men once called enemies had found something sacred in captivity. If you stood there at sunset, you could still imagine the faint sound of laughter, the clang of tin cups, the hum of a distant harmonica. And if you listened closely, the desert seemed to whisper what Keller had once written, "Mercy is the memory that survives every war." So when people asked him, years later, what Camp Papago was like, he would smile faintly and answer, "It was heaven compared to the Eastern Front." Then, after a pause, he would add, "And maybe, for a little while, it was heaven on earth."